With it being the end of February, we know what the UFC likes to do. They head down for their annual UFC Mexico City card. And you guessed it, Brandon Moreno is once again in the main event. Although he was originally scheduled to fight Kazakhstani fighter Asu Almabayev, Lonnie Kavanagh now steps in on somewhat short notice for the biggest fight of his career, even though he's coming off the first pro loss of his pro MMA career. But he's going up against a tough and tested former champion veteran Brandon Moreno, who's surely going to push the youngster as far as he's been pushed in the past. But can the youngster spoil the homecoming of Brandon Moreno? We'll find out this weekend. Also, in the co-main event, we got Marlon Chito Vera looking to get back on track as he takes on the streaking and rising contender David Martinez, who had a tremendous performance against Rob Font last time out. We got a total of, I believe, 13 fights for this UFC Mexico City card. So without further ado, let's get right into it. First fight up, in the middleweight division between Damian Pinas coming in at minus 260, going up against Wes Schultz, who comes in at plus 220. Now, starting off on the Damian side of things here, he is riding a 4-fight winning streak, although the one loss in his career came by DQ due to an illegal upkick that he landed. Since that DQ loss, he's been streaking, and obviously the biggest win of his career came last time around, where he took just about 100 seconds to finish Vitor Costa to earn his contract to the UFC through the Contender Series. That night, Costa tried utilizing a high volume, high output style to keep Pinas at bay. However, Damian eventually landed that big shot, that 1-2 jab cross down the pipe, and it was a walk-off KO for the Surinamese fighter. He actually, born in Suriname, trains out of Aruba, but has been changing things up in training at the PI and trying to get as many looks as possible. But his athleticism and power obviously makes him a very tough customer to deal with. He's only 23 years old as well, so he is still a raw product in a sense, but his athleticism and power, like I said, will aid him in a lot of his early victories, probably even getting him close to the ranking position, maybe the top 15 ranking within his first couple fights, if he can continue to get off on his big power striking. His grappling is slowly coming along as well. He's shown some decent defense through some of the fights I've been seeing as of late, but in terms of ranking, he is a BJJ blue belt, which he earned just about a week after he had earned his UFC contract in September of this past year. Now he's going up against a tough grappler here in Wes Schultz, who earned his contract as well on the same season of the Contender Series, where he took about 2 minutes to find that Sulayev stretch against Mario Mingaj. Beautiful performance there for him. He kept the pressure on him, hurt Mingaj pretty much from jump, and then eventually started smothering him with his usual grappling approach. And from there, he was able to sink in the submission to force the tap from his Italian opponent. That was the second shot on the Contender Series that Schultz got after giving us a spirited effort against Mansour Abdul Malik. He nearly finished Abdul Malik near the beginning of the second round, but unfortunately emptied his gas tank and ended up giving up a big position to Abdul Malik, who was able to get that TKO win. Schultz did have to go back to the regional scene to earn his way back to the Contender Series, but this is a guy that deserves to be in the UFC, but his lack of athleticism will probably keep him away from the rankings, or at least getting to a position where he can fight for a title. He is a all-action, forward-moving fighter that loves to take opponents to the ground, smother them with his grappling, and eventually either break them with his pace to get that TKO finish, or eventually find a submission and force the tap that way. He also trains at a Pura Vida BJJ out of Wisconsin. This is a tough matchup to really break down in terms of who's going to be successful with their style. Obviously, you see Pinas with that big power that he brings to the table, and Schultz going to be looking to smother him and drown him with his grappling. Unfortunately for Schultz, I expect the Arubian or Surinamese fighter, I don't know what you want to categorize him as, and yes, I am trying to avoid saying his last name because it's just going to make me chuckle anytime I try to say it, but still, Damian should go out there, land that big power to put Schultz away, but at minus 260, it's a little bit tricky, right? If Schultz can roll with a couple of these big shots, if he can get to some of his clinch game and smothering style, he could surely slow Damian down and eventually pull away in the second and third rounds, which is why at minus 260, I'm not too hot on Damian. The round 1 KO prop currently sits around plus 250 for Damian, and I think that's probably the better way to go rather than taking his chalk, because if this fight does reach round 2 and round 3, that probably means that Schultz's cardio and wrestling style will have caught up to Damian, and that will lead to Schultz eventually finding a late finish of his own. But in terms of an official prediction, I am going to go with Damian Pinas. I think he gets that round 1 knockout, and I think a lot of it comes from him banging on Schultz early and finding that first round KO. So give me Damian by knockout. Next up, in the featherweight division, we got the return of Eric Silva, who comes in at plus 525, going up against Francis Marshall, who comes in at minus 700. Now, starting off on the Silva side of things, he is on a 2-fight losing streak. He has not won a UFC fight since he earned his contract with the Contender Series in 2022, and his age is really not helping him either. Now, he came up short in his debut against TJ Brown in a back-and-forth fight where it seemed like the pressure and cardio advantage of Brown caught up to Silva, leading to Brown getting that third-round submission victory. Then in his next fight against Mohamed Naimov, it seemed like Silva injured his knee or his ankle or something in the opening seconds of that fight after he got hit with the spinning heel kick. After you watch the replay, you can see that Silva was more so reacting to his knee being injured than actually being hit clean with that wheel kick. Silva tried wrestling his way to a better and more safer position, but ultimately Naimov was able to get that top position and eventually get the TKO, but most certainly that finish came due to the injury. Silva is going to be 39 2 weeks after this weekend's fight, so he's definitely getting up there in age and not the ideal age to try to come back from a severe injury like that, especially with him being out of the action for over 2 years at this point. He is an all-action fighter that loves to move forward. His 5 wins before getting that UFC debut all came with him finishing his opponents under 1.5 rounds, with 4 of them coming in the first round and a lot of them coming by rear naked choke as well. That's his style. He likes to get opponents to the ground, work to that back position, and from there he's pretty damn good in terms of finishing that submission game. His striking, a little bit wild, a little bit reckless, and that's why he's often getting caught by these better fighters who can counter him and then thwart his grapple-heavy approach. Now he's going up against Francis Marshall, who I think a lot of people can agree kind of got screwed in his not his UFC debut, but his last UFC fight, which came in March of last year, where he lost a split decision to Myron Santos. Now, one judge gave Francis Marshall all 3 rounds, but the other 2 judges gave Santos round 2 and round 3. In the first round, Marshall landed a big shot to drop Santos, so I think all 3 judges agreed that Marshall deserved to win that round. But I thought Marshall did good work in rounds 2 and 3 to mix up his striking with some takedowns and control time to really thwart the type of a pressure and success that Santos was trying to have in the striking realm. I think almost everybody could agree that Marshall deserved the win there. And even Joe Rogan was in the cage while that decision was being read. And you can kind of see the expression on his face that, hey, we don't think that Santos won that fight, and for good reason. Marshall showed great improvements in that game. He was a big underdog going into that fight, as a lot of people thought that Santos could stop the takedowns and then butcher him on the feet, but Santos couldn't do any of that. Marshall was landing the better shots on the feet. He was landing takedowns and getting some good damage when he could, but still the judges somehow gave that fight to Santos. That snapped the momentum that Marshall had off of his previous win that he had by defeating Dennis Bazookia, and I believe Marshall is kind of underachieving at this stage in his career. He's now 2-3 through his 5 fights with the promotion, but he came in with a lot of heat, especially after how he dominated Conor Matthews on the Contender Series. He originally trained out of New Jersey, came up in that New Jersey area under former UFC fighter Kurt Pellegrino, but over his last couple of fights, he's gone down to American Top Team and really created a close bond with fellow UFC lightweight Grant Dawson. And that's where you see a lot of the improvements in Marshall's game starting to come to the surface. And I think we'll see him continue to build upon that, those improvements, that success that he has down at the training camp. And again, what should have been a win last time around against Myron Santos. Now, in this matchup against Eric Silva, I think it's pretty obvious that Marshall being at minus 700 kind of deserves that price tag. Silva's getting up there in age. Marshall's still quite young, 26 years old. I believe he's going to be 27 very shortly, so he has a ton of time to still show his improvements and how good he can actually be. And I think he'll utilize his grappling defensively here to keep Silva away from a dominant position. And then from there, I think we'll see Marshall showcase the better striking, which should lead to him eventually finding getting that knockout, maybe even a club and sub opportunity in rounds 2 or round 3. But even at minus 700, I'm comfortable parlaying Marshall to get the win here and get back on the winning track. All right, next up, in the women's flyweight division, we got Sofia Montenegro coming in at plus 230, going up against Ernesto Kareckaite, who comes in at minus 270. Now, starting off on the Montenegro side of things, who earned a contract through the Contender Series this past season, although it came off of a loss. It was a split decision loss that she had against Chairez. I believe Dana thought that Montenegro deserved to win the fight, hence why he still gave her a contract. But even if it was Montenegro that did get the win, I still think that Chairez would have gotten the contract as well, considering how bloody and entertaining that fight was. From jump, within the first minute and a half, Montenegro got cut very badly, and she was really struggling to deal with the jab of Chairez. Montenegro is a hard-nosed striker that loves to crash the pocket with big power punches, swarming her opponents with power punches, but that leaves her vulnerable to better strikers who can thwart her pressure with that straight shot down the pipe. And that's exactly what Chairez was doing. Montenegro had good success in the second round where she hurt Chairez and dropped her, and then enjoyed some good top control and top time. But unfortunately, she was unable to replicate that in the third round, even though she did get a takedown and get a minute or so of control time. Once Chairez found her way back to her feet, she was able to land the better shots, and it ended up being a very close fight that could have gone either way. Again, Montenegro improving her grappling ever so slightly. She's training alongside Eileen Perez, Juliana Martinez, I should say. I wanted to say Juliana Miller, who's the fighter that fought last week, but there was that Argentinian fighter that was too young on the Contender Series, but still ended up winning, didn't get signed to the Contender Series or to the UFC. Montenegro has also been training with her, and also former UFC fighter Silvana Gomez Juarez. So she has a good, cast of partners that she has trying to get her to the next level, and she's still only 26 years old. But at her best, I think she likes to apply her striking by moving forward and trying to get her opponents out of there. Now, she's going up against Ernesto Kareckaite, who picked up a split decision victory over Nicola Cagliari last time around. And that was a fight that I thought was pretty obvious that Kareckaite deserved to win. With, standing at 5'9" with a 71-inch reach, she's often going to be the taller and longer fighter in the cage, especially at flyweight. And that helps fuel her distance striking approach, where she strikes down the pipe, lands a lot of stinging damage. And even though her nickname is heavy-handed, she hasn't produced a knockout since the second fight in her pro career. She is often a fighter that just likes to stay behind the jab, stick and move, cut angles, pivot off whenever she can, and then try to stop any type of grappling approach her opponents try to take. Diony Barbosa was obviously able to take advantage of that, but we often see Kareckaite fighting off of her back, whether it's not settling for position, constantly keeping her head above her opponent's head, which makes it harder for her opponents to settle on top. She works her way back to the cage, works her way back to her feet, and then gets back to her striking style. Or if she ends up having to settle on her back, like she did in the last 30 seconds of her last fight, she stays very busy in terms of moving side to side, throwing up offense of her own, trying to get that knee shield position where she can push off and get back to her feet. And I like what I see there. She does have her own gym, I believe, out there in Lithuania, but she has completed the majority of her camp at Syndicate MMA, or at least the tail end of her training camp at Syndicate and the UFC PI in preparation for this big matchup against Sofia Montenegro. Now here, I believe that Kareckaite should get the win. I believe she was going to be the favorite, but I didn't believe that she'd be all the way up at minus 270. You have to give some credit to Montenegro's hard-nosed style, where she might be able to land some big shots, some looping shots, and maybe even mix in takedowns where she could take advantage of Kareckaite on the mat. But like I said, I like the improvements we've been seeing from Kareckaite in terms of her defensive grappling, but I still believe there might be some small holes that Montenegro could take advantage of. I'm still going to lean with Kareckaite as my prediction. I like her decision prop roughly around that plus 100 line, as I think it's going to be very hard to put away a fighter like Montenegro. But don't overlook Montenegro's chances. If she can land takedowns and settle on top, she could really grind this fight out and have some good success of her own. I do not think that Kareckaite should be near that, between that 70 to 75% indicated, because of the type of success Montenegro can have. I'm still going to go Kareckaite here. Kareckaite by decision. Look for her to land more stinging shots, start blooding the nose of Montenegro, and winning this fight on the scorecards. But it will play out closer than the odds indicate. But I'll still go Kareckaite and Kareckaite by decision. All right, next up in the featherweight division, we got the return of Douglas Silva, de Andrade, coming in at plus 185, going up against Javier Reyes, who comes in at minus 220. Now, starting off on the de Andrade side of things, he's one of those fighters where whenever I see him on the UFC schedule, I'm kind of surprised that he's still with the promotion or he hasn't even retired. He's 40 years old. He hasn't competed in nearly 2 years, and that's kind of more ammunition as to why I believe he wasn't a part of the roster. But here he is, looking to bounce back after the loss that he suffered at the hands of Miles Johns that night. He was really struggling to deal with the output and damage that was being thrown at him, and Johns did a great job in terms of landing his damage, staying on his bicycle, and kind of thwarting the power punching style of de Andrade. De Andrade has had the ability to pull off a few upsets here and there, but with him getting up there in age, it's obviously harder and harder for him to come in at a healthy weight, first and foremost, and secondly, for him to go out there and try to have success with the type of style that he brings to the table. He is also fighting at 145 pounds in this fight compared to the 135 pounds that he used to fight at in the past. So he'll probably have a bit of a size disadvantage and strength disadvantage he's going to have to overcome against his fellow opponent. But normally when de Andrade is successful, he's stalking his opponents, he's marching them down, landing his big strikes and looking to knock them out, or just land enough shots over the course of 2 rounds to still get his hand raised on the scorecards. But that's going to get harder and harder to do the older and older he gets, considering that he relies on that power and that fast twitch muscle, which we know really starts to dwindle the later a fighter gets into their career. Now he's going up against Javier Reyes, who's making his UFC debut after earning his contract through the Contender Series, knocking out Justice Torres. I believe that fight didn't even last about 2 or 3 minutes before Reyes eventually found that big shot to put him away. Reyes is a guy that I've had on my eye on for a long time now, since May of 2024 when he started competing for the LFA. He earned his 8th straight win that night, but was unable to capitalize on it as he eventually got knocked out by eventual LFA champion and recent UFC signee Ryan Douglas. Reyes returned back to the Latin American scene where he got 2 straight finishes and earned himself an FFC title. Then he went back to the LFA and came up short in a very close fight against Chris Makate. He ended up bouncing back just about a month later in a main event slot for the LFA by submitting Lance Lawrence. Fun fight there, but Reyes obviously able to get the finish there. Reyes is a very well-rounded fighter that I believe originally comes from Colombia, but a lot of his training camp takes place in Arizona at the same gym that Waldo Cortez Acosta trains out of. Reyes is very well-rounded, has some good power in his shots, but I think at his best, he does like to implement the grappling game where he often showcases good pressure from that top position and then rains down with big shots or threatens with submissions as well. He also has a very experienced and legitimate 22-5 record before even coming into the UFC, so you got to believe that he's going to be very prepared no matter who the UFC ends up throwing at him. And they're throwing at him a very experienced UFC opponent here in Douglas Silva de Andrade, who has been in the UFC 10, 12 years at this point in time, has fought the best and the worst of the division. But unfortunately for Douglas, I think he's going to struggle here with the well-rounded game of Javier. I think Javier will be able to land better damage, but I ultimately think it's going to come down to the grappling for Reyes. Look for him to utilize his size advantage to take de Andrade to the ground, really grind him out, slow de Andrade down from that top position, and that could either open up a finishing spot for Reyes or him grinding this fight out by decision. I will say this. De Andrade will be dangerous in the first couple minutes of this fight with the power he possesses. Reyes has been knocked out in the past, most notably by Ryan Douglas, and De Andrade could absolutely replicate that. However, the size disadvantage for him here is really going to work against him, and I'm expecting Reyes to get a hold of him, drag him to the ground, and eventually grind him out and win this on the scorecards. I think we see Reyes start his UFC career off on the right foot. All right, moving over to the bantamweight division now. We got Christian Quinonez coming in at minus 650, going up against Chris Moutinho, who comes in at plus 475. Now, Quinonez is riding a 2-fight losing streak, but it's been over 2 years since we've seen him in action. He's obviously still only 29 years old, so still plenty of time to really grow into this UFC roster spot, but he's really been struggling to get success. I believe he only has one win in the UFC, which was that upset knockout victory that he held over Khalid Taha, but he was unable to build upon that as he suffered 2 straight submission losses. One at the hand of Kyung Ho Kong, who he had some solid success against, but eventually got clubbed and subbed. And then he was performing pretty well against Raoni Barcelos in February of 2024, where one judge actually scored both of the first 2 rounds for Quinonez. Then eventually he fell short to that pace and pressure and grappling game of Barcelos and eventually got submitted that night. I think Quinonez has kind of underachieved in the UFC. He's very experienced, has good skills from all aspects of the game. He has solid striking, good grappling. I'd say he's a better striker than he is grappler. And he has some decent knockout power as well. 4 of his 5 losses have come in round 2 or 3. So that's definitely something that you have to be worried about whenever he's fighting somebody with a better gas tank than him, or somebody that could provide a high pace and high pressure style that he may not be comfortable with, just as we saw in the Raoni Barcelos fight. Now he's going up against Chris Moutinho, who has really been dealt a shit hand, with the UFC. From his initial UFC debut against Sean O'Malley, where he got beat on for, 2.5 rounds and eventually finished at the ending of the 3rd round. He eventually took 8 months off, came back and got styled on and knocked out by Guido Canetti. Then he got cut. Then he went on a 5-fight winning streak on the regional scene, finishing all 5 opponents, and even including a win over Johnny Campbell, who was the last fighter to beat him before coming to the UFC. Moutinho was then given a short notice return to the promotion, eventually coming up short to Malcolm Wellmaker, who knocked him out 2.5 minutes into that fight. Now he's getting a full training camp against a fighter that's probably not as dangerous as Wellmaker, but still more experienced than Wellmaker in the form of Christian Quinonez. Moutinho at his best is a high-pressure, high-volume striker with mediocre durability. I know whenever we talk about Moutinho, people like to bring up his heart and his durability, but the fact of the matter is he's been knocked out in all 7 of his losses, or finished at least in all 7 of his losses. So how good is his durability or greediness when you take that into consideration? At his best, he can move forward, land combinations. He has some stinging power at times, but I think his lack of athleticism will cause him a lot of trouble against guys that are stronger, faster, and more powerful than him. And unfortunately for him, I think he's facing exactly that this weekend in Christian Quinonez. Now, am I so confident in Quinonez to play him at minus 650? Probably not. This fight taking place at altitude. Obviously, Quinonez has some experience training at this altitude. Moutinho obviously fights with that style where he can move forward and fight with a high pressure, high pace, and that could potentially cause Quinonez issues, especially if Quinonez is forced into deeper water. So I'm still not picking Moutinho. Don't get me wrong. I think he's a fringe UFC guy. I think Quinonez is the more skilled fighter here. But if he can't get that finish or at least hold on long enough to see the final bell, Moutinho could have some success and pull out the cardio issues that we've seen from Quinonez in the past. So official prediction will be Quinonez by decision, but maybe a flyer on Moutinho round 2 or round 3 could pay out and be fruitful. Who knows? But I'm going to go Quinonez here. I just don't think he's worth the chalk. All right. Next up in the women's bantamweight division, we got Eileen Perez coming in at minus 185, going up against Macy Chiasson, who comes in at plus 160. Now, starting off on the Perez side of things, she has been streaking as of late, 5-0 since stumbling in her UFC debut back in September of 2022. Last time out, she pulled off an upset victory as a plus 200 underdog against Carol Hossa. That was a fight where I really felt that Hossa would be able to stifle the grappling of Perez and then touch her up on the feet, but Hossa really didn't seem to wake up until the 3rd round of that fight, allowing Perez to get to her game and grind out those first 2 rounds. Perez doesn't offer much in the striking realm as she throws a lot of flashy kicks just so she can stay safe at distance and then eventually find that opportunity to change levels or initiate the clinch and get fights to the ground with her just strength and physicality, which is what she often has an advantage in over her opponents. Like I said, she doesn't bring much threat with her striking game. It's all about the grappling, and it's all about just maintaining that top position. Her cardio often doesn't look the greatest, especially with the style that she fights with, which is why opponents are often able to win that 3rd round, but still not enough to overtake what Perez was successful with in the first 2 rounds. Her only finish in the UFC came against Daria Zalesniakova in September of 2024, where she was a big favorite and had a obvious grappling advantage, and so much so to the point that she was actually able to work to a finish. Now she's going up against Macy Chiasson, who similarly to Eileen Perez, utilizes her physicality a lot to get the better of her opponents. Unfortunately, she's on a 2-fight losing streak, though. She came up short against Kathleen Vera in a fight that was originally scheduled to be contested at 135 pounds. During fight week, Vera asked for that fight to go up to 145 pounds, which is usually what Chiasson asks, right? She usually has trouble with her weight cuts and getting down to 135 pounds, but it was Vera who asked to fight up at 145 pounds, and that seemingly worked against Chiasson because she was unable to get the takedowns. She was forced to strike with Vera, who is a better striker, and that's where we saw Vera really start to style on Chiasson. Then last time around, she went up against Yana Santos, missing weight that fight, obviously. And she was unable to have really much success against Santos. Santos used great footwork through the first 2 rounds, utilizing footwork, output, and well-timed strikes to batter Chiasson, who was really struggling in the striking game and really struggling to get a hold of Yana Santos. Chiasson did end the fight strongly with a takedown, submission attempt, and some nasty ground and pound, but unfortunately it wasn't enough for her to get the win. After that fight had wrapped up, you can see her going over to the cameras and being like, I want that fight. That's me, all me. But she failed to overlook the fact that she had a slow start. It was clear that Santos, with her footwork and just marching on the outside, was getting the better of the work that Chiasson was doing while trying to push the pressure. Now, I don't think Chiasson will ever achieve the potential that a lot of people expected of her when she first came into the UFC. And I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I think there was a very high expectation for her, especially considering she was only 2-0 coming off the Ultimate Fighter and then getting that win against Pani Kianzad to get the contract. She is now 8-5 in the UFC, 2-3 over her last 5 fights, including the 2-fight losing streak that she's currently on. And I think that kind of just goes to show that she's hitting her ceiling, and the fact that she's 34 years old. She is becoming a slightly better striker. She's becoming a more well-rounded mixed martial artist, but we can see when she can't get to her grappling to keep herself safe, that's where we'll often see her start to fall short. Now, in this matchup against Eileen Perez, I am kind of surprised that Perez is all the way up at -185. I get the trajectory doesn't look the greatest for Chiasson, and then obviously Perez on a 5-fight winning streak, but I believe these women are kind of the same in terms of having to rely on that physicality to get their wins. I think Chiasson might be a little bit stronger. I think she might be a little bit better in terms of inflicting damage as well, whereas Perez is more so just dead set on trying to maintain that top pressure, maintain that top control, and then just try to grind opponents out that way. I think she's going to struggle to do that here against Chiasson. Look for Chiasson to utilize her grappling defensively, try to keep this fight upright, or even land takedowns of her own, and I think that she could be the one that ends up getting her hand raised just by landing a little bit more damage, and I think that will be the difference maker in this matchup. So give me Chiasson and Chiasson by decision. All right, moving over to the men's middleweight division now, we got the UFC debut of Ryan Gandra coming in at -550, going up against Jose Medina, who comes in at +400. Now, starting off on the Gandra side of things, he earned his contract through the Contender Series this past season by knocking out Trent Miller in the first round. Now, Gandra, it only took him less than 3 minutes to find the button and put his opponent away, and that marked his 7th straight victory, with his only loss coming in his second pro fight back in April of 2022. It's been 4 years since that defeat, and he's made massive improvements in his game, largely with his striking, where he does a great job in terms of utilizing his range and his reach to land those big shots from distance, but he also has a brown belt in BJJ and Judo in case he needs to take fights to the ground to have success. He's mixed up his training a lot in recent years, from training alongside Paulo Costa to going over to shoot to box Diego Lima and training alongside former lightweight champion Charles Oliveira. He's a solid addition to the middleweight division that might be able to crack into the rankings, but I don't think he's as good to the point of eventually getting into title contention. But he is dangerous and continues to come through with finishes. Now he's going up against Jose Medina, who still somehow has a UFC contract even after losing 3 straight matchups. And even after losing on the Contender Series very dominantly against Magomed Gadzhiesulov. Now, Medina is a guy who is now 0-8 in terms of winning rounds over his last 4 fights. He got outworked by Gadzhiev, got outworked by Reyes over the 6 rounds that they fought, but he ended up getting knocked out by Atiba Gauthier and submitted by Dushko Todorovic. So again, 0-8 in terms of rounds. He's just not that good. He's tough, durable, but that's even starting to dwindle now at the UFC level, especially when fighters realize that he can be taken down, grinded out, and even submitted if you can get that submission game going. He has some sneaky power. He's been doing his best in terms of getting in shape, so I'll give him credit for that. He's tried to change up his training as much as he can. He even went to Killcliff FC for his last training camp, but it seems like he set up shop at the UFC PI in Mexico this time around. But no matter how much training he does, I just don't think he has what it takes to be successful at this level. And I would be surprised if this is not his last fight in the UFC. I fully believe that Ryan Gandra will get the positions he needs to dominate Medina here. I think I think Gandra would be best served to utilize his judo and his BJJ to get Medina to the ground. And then from there, I think we see Gandra eventually sink in a submission to force the tap from Medina. It's obvious why Gandra is a big favorite, but he needs to be aware of the possible durability of Medina, and that could help him in deeper water. So that's why I think that Gandra needs to take this fight to the ground, utilize his BJJ game similar to what Dushko Todorovic was able to do, and let that lead to a submission win, which is ultimately going to be my final prediction here. So like I said, give me Ryan Gandra and Gandra by submission. All right, moving over to the bantamweight division now. We got Santiago Luna coming in at -450, going up against Angel Pacheco, who comes in at +350. Now, Santiago Luna made his short notice UFC debut back in September, where he stepped in for David Martinez, who got elevated to the co-main event of that card, and he took on Kwang Lee, and I believe he was only a -125, -130 favorite that night, but he showed why he probably should have been even chalkier. Now, he did stumble at the first couple seconds of that fight where he got wobbled by Kwang Lee, but Luna quickly got his wits back about him, got back to a couple of wrestling and clinch exchanges, and then eventually uncorked a nasty left hook and followed up with big ground and pound to knock out Kwang Lee. That earned him his 7th victory as a pro. He also went 3-0 as an amateur, but he is a nasty prospect coming from a wrestling background, but he's rounded out his striking game so well to the point that he can even just rely on his striking to eventually knock his opponents out. He's finished all 7 of his pro wins, and he continues to improve at a steady rate. I'm not sure which gym he was training out of in Mexico, but since moving to California, he's been training a lot with Marlon Vera, and that's obviously helped him try to elevate his level, but I think he's just going to continue to grow, and this could be a kid that eventually starts getting into title contention over the next couple of years. He's still only 21 years old, so there's still a lot of time for him to flesh out and gain the experience that he needs to be effective against the ranked opponents in the top 10 of the division. And I feel like the UFC is slowly bringing him along, especially with how they've matched him up for this weekend. Now he's going up against Angel Pacheco, who is now 0-2 over his last 2 fights. The first of those fights being his Contender Series matchup against Danny Silva, where he got picked apart pretty much for 15 minutes, but his durability and his grit kept him in that matchup, even though he was getting picked apart for the most part. Dana enjoyed it so much to the point that he still signed Pacheco, and then we saw last time around why Pacheco probably didn't deserve the UFC contract. He got outworked and outgunned by Colin Loughran, who nearly finished him multiple times in that 15 minutes, but Pacheco continued to move forward and stay in that fight. It was just clear he was behind a lot in terms of athleticism and skills. Now, with that said, there are a few names on the regional scene that Pacheco was able to defeat that kind of had me scratching my head in terms of how he was able to beat those guys and then eventually earn that contract, the opportunity to fight on the Contender Series, but I think that we're seeing in recent fights that he just doesn't have what it takes to compete at this level. He's tough, he's gritty, durable, has sneaky power in his hands. I think he's very good when he can get into his groove with the striking and throw with combinations, but he's often going to be at an athleticism disadvantage, a speed disadvantage, and even talent disadvantage, just as the case with him for this weekend as he takes on Santiago Luna. I don't know if Pacheco had many options in terms of who the UFC is offering him, but this is a horrible matchup for him to take, in my opinion. I think Luna is better than him everywhere, and I think if Luna can't knock Pacheco out, he can get to his wrestling and smother Pacheco for 15 minutes because he has the cardio to do so as well. I think Luna is just far superior to him, and I'm kind of surprised that we're only seeing minus 450 on Luna. I think by fight time, he balloons all the way up to minus 900, and I think he ends up looking that number here. And even though Pacheco has been tough to put away, I think Luna will eventually work to a position where he can find the finish. Whether it's by KO or submission, I fully believe Luna has the skills to put the durable Pacheco away and win this fight inside the distance. All right, moving over to the flyweight division now. We got Imanol Rodriguez coming in at minus 400 going up against Kevin Borjas, who comes in at plus 330. Now, Rodriguez earned his contract to the Contender Series last time around as he knocked out Roque Conceição in the first round of their matchup. Now, prior to that, Rodriguez was a part of the most recent season of The Ultimate Fighter and had a very controversial fight against Joseph Morales in their semifinal, a fight that could have gone either way. I think Morales did do enough to earn that victory, but it was a controversial decision nonetheless, so much so that the UFC decided to give him an immediate shot on the Contender Series, and he came through with flying colors with how he was able to get that quick knockout. Now, Rodriguez comes from a wrestling background, but this guy has done a great job, similar to Santiago Luna, who I talked about in the previous fight, in terms of rounding out his game. His striking has become more dangerous. He goes out there, and I believe he's finished all of his opponents as well. He's very tough to deal with just because of that constant forward work, constant forward movement, and that allows him to break his opponents and eventually get them out of there. He's done a great job in terms of mixing up his training as well. He was on Team Cormier on The Ultimate Fighter, so he followed Cormier back up to California to train at DC's new gym, and it's obviously helped him out there. But he spent the last month and a half down at the UFC PI in Mexico City, surrounding himself with the likes of Daniel Zellhuber, who fights later on in this card, and even Brian Zercher, who's a high-level prospect who will eventually get another shot to get into the UFC. This kid is really good, and he's still only 26 years old, but he's going to be put up against a tough Peruvian fighter here in Kevin Borjas. Now, Borjas is looking to showcase that he can perform just as well as he did against Ronaldo Rodriguez, where he pulled off an upset that night and just battered Rodriguez over the course of 15 minutes. He nearly finished Rodriguez a few times throughout those 15 minutes, but was unable to get the finish, but still managed to get the dominant decision victory. Unfortunately, he was unable to replicate that against Sumudarji, who ended up sweeping him on the scorecards, easily touching up Borjas from distance, thwarting any type of grappling that Borjas tried to initiate as well. And Borjas eventually kept finding himself in the clinch or shooting for takedowns, but then Sumudarji got out of those positions, touched him up on the feet, and easily won that fight by decision. At his best, Borjas is an educated striker with decent power, and he does a good job in terms of just landing those combinations, getting out into range and trying to get work back to it, and he's also a decent counter striker. But as we've seen in his losses against Joshua Van, Alessandro Costa, and Sumudarji, if he's fighting more slick strikers, he's obviously going to find it hard to have much success of his own. He has decent cardio to go 15 minutes if he needs to. I believe he's also a training partner of Jesus Pinedo, who we know is a high-level striker as well. So you can see the nastiness in his game when he gets into his groove. But he also seems to me like a guy that's kind of a fringe UFC fighter, maybe bottom of the barrel 125er as well. In this matchup against Imanol Rodriguez, it makes complete sense why the Mexican fighter is a chalky favorite. Borjas might be the slightly more technical striker, but I believe the overall advantages that Rodriguez has in this matchup will continue to thwart the style that Borjas wants to bring. Look for Rodriguez to throw big shots with Borjas, but eventually find those moments to change levels and get this fight to the ground where I really believe he can work Borjas down and eventually work to a dominant and finishing position. I think Rodriguez is legit. I think he is going to achieve his potential, and he will be a kid that one day ends up fighting for the title. He's still very young in his career, so there's no need to really force him to get to the next level so quickly. I'm going to take Rodriguez inside the distance, and I really wouldn't mind him as a parlay piece either here. All right, Moving over to the flyweight division, we got Edgar Chairez coming in at minus 325 going up against Felipe Bunes, who comes in at plus 275. Now, Chairez is looking to build upon his submission victory over CJ Vergara. That was a solid win for Chairez to get back into the win column after coming up short against Joshua Van at Noche UFC. Chairez is one of the more dangerous and threatening fighters in terms of finding finishes, just as he showed against Lacerda and Vergara. When he originally popped up on my radar was when he was on the Contender Series taking on Clayton Carpenter, and that was a fight back in 2022 where I believe he outperformed his odds, even though he ended up coming up on the losing end of that fight. He showcased his aggressiveness, his cardio, his lethal striking game, and that caused Carpenter a few issues, but Carpenter was able to land his takedowns and really grind the rest of that fight out. Chairez went back to the regional scene, picked up a nasty submission victory over recent UFC signee Yanni Vasquez, and that eventually earned him his contract to get into the UFC on short notice, taking on, I believe it was Tatsuro Taira. It was a fight that Chairez wasn't doing all that bad with before he made a few bad fight IQ mistakes, specifically trying to pull guillotine against Taira, and that led to him eventually getting grinded out over the course of 15 minutes there. He's been kind of stagnant in recent years. He's been in the UFC for 2.5 years now. He's 2-2 with 1 no contest. He competed 3 times in 2023, twice in 2024, and only once in 2025. So now, fighting in February of 2026. Hopefully he can get in at least 1 or 2 more fights so he can get a little bit more busy. He's still only 30 years old, so not in a huge rush to really get things going, but this is usually when a fighter is at their prime, and he's going to want to try to take advantage of those prime years. At his best, very aggressive, very lethal with his Muay Thai game, very aggressive with his Jiu-Jitsu game as well, and he has what it takes to be very competitive against a lot of the flyweights in the division, and I think we're going to see a lot of that here as he takes on Felipe Bunes. Now, Bunes is coming off of a decision loss to Rafael Estevam back in August in a fight where he started the fight pretty well, with all 3 judges giving him round 1, but then in round 3, we saw a tweet on the screen during the broadcast that all judges gave, everybody scoring the fight was giving the first 2 rounds to Estevam. However, all 3 judges actually gave that round to Bunes. Luckily, it didn't end up mattering as Estevam did enough to grind out rounds 2 and round 3. It seemed like Bunes blew his gas tank in round 1, trying to complete that buggy choke position that he had. Just really couldn't, secure that position against a BJJ black belt like Estevam. It was going to be tough for Bunes to secure that. I'm surprised that Bunes managed to hold his wits about him over the last 10 minutes of that fight, considering how gassed he looked, but he was enjoying a lot of time on bottom with Estevam really grinding him out in those positions. Bunes is dangerous early, as he's shown in a lot of his fights, even when he beat Yuma Horiuchi on the Contender Series, on the LFA platform. He made his UFC debut against Joshua Van, had a solid first round, but then as we know with Joshua Van, he starts slow, picks it up in the second and third rounds, and that's where he eventually finished Bunes. And then Bunes' lone UFC win so far was when he caught Jose Johnson in an armbar and forced a tap in the first round of that fight. Bunes is a fun fighter, aggressive, starts off hot, but fizzles out pretty quickly, and that's going to be his issue fighting in the UFC against guys that can thwart that early success that he normally has and force him to fight into deeper waters where he's often a lot less threatening. And I'm expecting Chairez to thwart that early pressure from Bunes here, and then he eventually work to a second or third round finish. And it seems like a lot of bettors are liking the Chairez side, considering when I studied him mid last week, he was minus 235. Now to find him all the way up at minus 325, it makes sense why people are jumping on the Chairez side of things here. But don't count out Bunes' early possibility to get the win here. He could definitely hurt Chairez. He could definitely have some success there. But I think that Chairez will fight through those positions. I think we'll see Chairez also showcase a better cardio game, and that will eventually lead to Chairez getting the finish in the second or third round. If we get a decent price on the under 2.5, if that's what it ends up being set at, I wouldn't mind that. You know what? Let's do it live. While I'm breaking this fight down for you guys, I do believe they have the totals out for it now. Let's see what they set that total at. Yeah, they have the total at 1.5, and they have the under 1.5 at plus 120. They have the fight doesn't go to decision at minus 200. That might be the line to actually pull a trigger on rather than the chalky line on Chairez because of the early finishing capabilities of Bunes. But my prediction will still be Chairez. Chairez inside the distance, and I think he gets it done within 2.5 rounds. All right, next up, we got a lightweight clash here between Daniel Zellhuber, who comes in at minus 500, going up against King Green, who comes in at plus 375. Now, starting off on the Zellhuber side of things, he is coming off 2 straight losses now, really thwarting the run that he was on to start off his UFC career. The wins against Lando Venata, Christos Giagos, and Francisco Prado were solid showcases of him improving his game, right? He's still only 26 years old, so still very young. But then he had that war at Noche UFC against Esteban Ribovics, coming up short by decision that night. Very close fight, but it was clear that Ribovics ended up landing more damaging shots. And then last time around against Michael Johnson, nearly 40-year-old Michael Johnson, Daniel Zellhuber got touched up in the first 2 rounds, had some success in the third round as Johnson was starting to slow down, but he just couldn't outdo the type of work that Johnson was doing in the first 2 rounds. Now, Zellhuber is still trying to find himself. Like I said, 26 years old. He's been jumping around at a lot of different training camps. He's gone to Extreme Couture. He went to Fight Ready for a few weeks after his last loss. But now it seems like he's really locking in over there at the UFC PI. But when you have training partners like Imanol Rodriguez and Brian Zercher, it makes sense why he wants to stay there, especially in Mexico City where he's going to be fighting at altitude. Why not train there as well to really prepare yourself to have to go 15 minutes if that's the case? Zellhuber at his best is a slick striker from distance, good kickboxer, solid boxer, good hands, straight shots down the pipe, decent speed as well. But we're seeing where fighters are able to take advantage of him, and that's his striking defense. Some of that can be lacking at times, which is why he gets hurt and hit by Ribovics and Johnson. But then you see in other fights where his striking defense is more than enough on point, like it was against Francisco Prado, who's a big power puncher. So it's really hit and miss with Zellhuber, especially at this stage of his career. He is very experienced, right? 18 pro fights, 15 pro wins, fought and beat some pretty experienced guys, but we're starting to rethink what his ceiling can be, especially with the potential we saw from him when he first came off the Contender Series. Now he's going up against a tough veteran here in King Green, who's coming off of a split decision win over Lance Gibson Jr. from back in December. Now, Green was originally scheduled to fight Diego Ferreira in August, but I believe a fight week injury to Ferreira caused Green to get off that card, and eventually we saw Green. Was it Ferreira or Green? I can't recall who it was, but I remember Green pulled out late in one of his fights as well. But either way, he wanted to still end off the year with another fight. They give him short notice UFC debutant Lance Gibson Jr., and I don't know why the scorecards read split decision there. I thought Green clearly won that fight from minute 1 to minute 15, especially with how much Gibson was backing up almost the entirety of that fight. The first round, you could probably give Gibson 1 round, I think it was, but for the entire time, Green was walking him down, thwarting the blitz attacks of Gibson with his jabs and combinations. Green also doubled him up on strikes as well. Gibson landed a takedown in round 2, but couldn't do much with it as Green quickly worked back to his feet. But Green showcased that he can still perform at a decently high level with his combination striking game. The issue with him has been his durability as of late, right? He's been finished a few times. That's something you always need to keep in mind when he's going up against big finishers like obviously Jalen Turner, Mauricio Hufi, and even Paddy Pimblett. But he can still beat the likes of Jim Miller like he absolutely whomped at UFC 300, and then the type of performance he put on against Lance Gibson Jr. Now, I don't know how anybody can be confident with Zellhuber at minus 500. He's back-to-back now, fumbled the bag against older guys too, right? An older guy in Michael Johnson. King Green kind of finding him around that Michael Johnson type of speed, but still, I think Johnson has the speed advantage compared to King Green. So I think we might not see Green have as much success as Johnson did. And if Zellhuber can clap back and if he can counter all the types of strikes that Green is throwing at him, he could definitely land the better strikes. Zellhuber will hold a 2-inch height advantage or 3-inch height advantage as well as a 6-inch reach advantage. And you're going to believe he wants to exaggerate that as much as possible against the veteran here. even with that said, I don't want to shoot on Zellhuber at minus 500. Maybe look at what the Zellhuber KO prop is. That could be a better way to go about it. That's going to be my ultimate prediction here. But we learn our lessons time and time again. Do not parlay Zellhuber against an educated striker, and that's what he's fighting here. I wouldn't hate on anybody looking to take a little bit of a shot on green, but I'm still going to go with the Mexican here to show out in front of a hometown crowd and give me Zellhuber by knockout, but minus 500 is just way too wide. All right, co-main event time now as we have Ecuadorian Marlon Chito Vera hoping to spoil the homecoming of David Martinez. You got plus 235 on Vera and minus 275 on Martinez. Now, starting off on the Vera side of things have been rough as of late. 1-4 in his last 5 fights, 3-fight losing streak right now, but maybe we can cut him some slack considering the types of opponents he's coming up short against. The first of those 3 losses coming in a title fight in a an undeserving title shot against Chiasson O'Malley. He gets absolutely battered over 25 minutes and loses that decision. Then he goes up against Davison Figueiredo in a fight where he couldn't really find much success, where Figueiredo was out-grappling him and then landing better shots. And then last time around against Ayman Zahabi, very, very weird fight. Vera was very pissed off about the decision that night, but I don't think he has much reason to. That was a close fight. The biggest moment of that fight went to him in round 2 when he dropped Zahabi, but he couldn't seal the deal as Zahabi was able to finagle his way out of that. In round 3, Zahabi managed to pull the momentum back into his favor, outstriking Vera 37-24. And again, I thought that first round was very close, and I can understand why you score that round for Zahabi as well. So Vera has only himself to blame. He's not throwing with as much volume as he should to be as pissed off as he was, right? Normally he's a guy who's very aggressive, throws a lot of strikes, likes to move forward, tries to break his opponents and land his big shots. But as we've been seeing in recent fights, he can either be out-grappled or he can be outstruck because of how reckless and wild some of his striking exchanges end up becoming. He's 33 years old, so he's not all that old. He has, a crazy amount of experience. That's 35 fights worth of experience, fighting champions, fighting contenders, fighting guys that are on the come up as well. But you start seeing where his ceiling is just because he can't really take it up to that next notch. I think he's better off in a 5-round fight, as we've seen in the past, like when he knocked out Dominic Cruz. But in 3-round fights, he usually has a lot of time to make up and a lot of output to make up because of how slow of a starter he often is. Now he's going up against David Martinez, who pulled off a tremendously big victory last time around in a short notice call up to the co-main event when he took on Rob Font and outstruck him and won that fight 2-1 on the scorecards. He was on the Contender Series back in 2024 and outstruck his opponent Xavier Franklin very easily won that matchup, and then he made his UFC debut against Simon Oliveira in March of last year, and he was able to pull off the first round knockout specifically. Now, he was scheduled to fight Kwang Lee in September, but the opportunity to fight Rob Font presented itself, and he jumped on it. He was 12-1 at the time, faced some decent competition, even under the Combate Global promotion that he fought with before coming to the UFC. And he showcases a very solid kickboxing game, a mobile striking game. He blitzes the pocket very well with his combinations and then cuts out onto an angle, pivots off, and it's very hard for opponents to really get back and hit him in return. In the fight against Font, solid first round. Second round, he felt a little bit of adversity as Font landed with a little bit more damage, but then in the third round, Martinez managed to get it back into play, landed his combinations, ended the round strong by forcing Rob Font to shoot, and then he landed some big ground and pound to get the, lasting impression of that third round. He's a very, very talented striker, elite kicking game, moves very well, like I said, and his cardio, very high level. Also, he is a doctor by day, which is absolutely crazy. Now, here in this matchup against Marlon Vera, it's obvious why Martinez is such a big favorite. He seems to be the slicker striker. He should be able to stick and move very effectively here. He holds a bit of a speed advantage, which I think will come into play. And I wouldn't even be surprised to see Vera try to shoot for takedowns to try to contain and muzzle Martinez's style that way. But I think he's going to struggle to do that. He's not a great wrestler. Martinez is a great counter wrestler and has good defensive grappling. And I think in the striking realm, I think we'll see Martinez land much more effective and much better shots. I think think it kind of looks, between the Sean O'Malley and the what's the other fight? The Ayman Zahabi fight. I think it looks like a little bit of a clash of those two fights where it's not as dominant as the O'Malley fight, but it's going to look more dominant than what Zahabi was able to do to Vera. So give me Martinez, and we know Vera, insane durability. It's going to be hard to knock him out. So I'm going to take Martinez, and Martinez by decision. All right, that now brings us to our flyweight main event of the evening, where we got former champion Brandon Moreno coming in at minus 225, going up against Lonnie Kavanagh, who comes in at plus 190. Now, we saw Moreno back in December, where he ended up getting TKO'd by Tatsuro Taira in the second round of their matchup. That was a tough fight for Moreno, who did start off pretty well, landed some good shots, but it was very hard for him to get away from the grappling of Taira in round 2. I counted about 20 unanswered shots that Taira was able to land on the back of Moreno, especially with that back position, and I believe the referee gave Moreno many opportunities to try to work out of that position, but he was eating too many big and clean shots that the referee was forced to step in and stop it. Moreno had his two-fight winning streak snapped that night, but again, it's not a bad loss, especially when you consider that Taira is now scheduled to fight for the title in April against Joshua Van. But Moreno showed in the Usyk fights and the Albazi fights that he's still a very high-level fighter, even at 32 years old. He's still in his prime. When he's at his best, he utilizes his boxing combinations very slick. He also has a good enough grappling game to lean on that if he needs to. And we know his cardio is super high level considering how many 5-round fights we've seen him in. Also, even at altitude, he's been performing well, even when he's been fighting in Mexico City. That loss that he suffered to Brandon Royval was a very un-Moreno-like performance. We saw him be very predictable. Royval was able to land a better variety of shots. It was a close fight. Royval still deserved to win it, but I thought we saw Moreno go back to the well too much that night against Royval. Then he went back to the drawing board before the Albazi fight and showcased a much better performance, and he was able to touch up Albazi to win that fight pretty clearly over the course of 25 minutes. Now he's going up against Lonnie Kavanagh here, who suffered his first loss in 10 fights at the hands of Charles Johnson, and he got finished that night as well in the second round, and that fight was back in August. Now that fight took place in Shanghai, which is, I believe, where his parents are from or where he was born. So he represents China, in some of his fights, but he does train out of the UK. He trains at a Great Britain top team headed by former UFC bantamweight Brad Pickett, who's done a great job in terms of creating a great gym there and great atmosphere. And Kavanagh was one of his prized possessions, right? Outside of Nathaniel Wood, Lonnie Kavanagh was the guy that Brad Pickett was beating the drum on a lot. And he showcased why through his Contender Series performance, where he knocked out Antoine Ho in the first round in his big win over Jose Ochoa. And then he showcased his diversity in the Felipe Dos Santos fight, where he outstruck him in the first round and then got to his grappling in the second and third rounds to grind that fight out. He was unable to do that against Charles Johnson, though. He was up in the first round, outstriking Johnson, landing the better shots. Then he started getting to his grappling in the second round, but Johnson showcased great grappling defense, continuously working back to his feet, and then applying that pressure on Kavanagh. And about 2 minutes into that second round, you can see Kavanagh starting to suck wind, starting to slow down, and Johnson sensed it, put his foot on the gas, and eventually got Kavanagh out of there near the ending of the second round. And that's going to be Kavanagh's kind of issue and something that he needs to work on moving forward. He wants to try to stay safe. He wants to find ways that even if his opponent is pressuring him, if he can't lean on his grappling, at least try to stay safe enough in the striking realm where he feels a little bit more comfortable and where he won't gas himself out as quickly, just as we saw in the Charles Johnson fight. He's very well-rounded. He's very skilled. He has some good knockout power as well. But for his career, I think this is a horrible decision for him to fight a guy like Moreno on short notice coming off of your first loss. Now I get it. It's kind of a win-win situation, right? You fight Moreno, you beat him, you launch yourself into title contention immediately. You lose, you took the fight on short notice, you fought a former champion, you stepped out of your level and tried to test yourself. I think he would have been better suited to just hold on to his fight that he had originally scheduled, which was 2 weeks after this fight, where he was supposed to take on Bruno Silva. But he wants to challenge himself. All props to the kid. Unfortunately for him, I think he's really up against it here against Moreno. Moreno has great durability, as we obviously know. Moreno has insane cardio, as we obviously know. Kavanagh could make this competitive in the first round or two, but I think once we start getting into deeper water, the altitude is going to start biting Kavanagh in the ass, and I think that's where the experience of Moreno really starts to come through, and we see him start to put the pressure on Kavanagh and eventually lead to a round 4 or round 5 finish for the former champion. So I'm kind of surprised the line is moving against Moreno. When I originally studied this early last week, he was roughly around that minus 270 line. Now he's down to minus 225. I think this is a phenomenal line to take advantage of, and I think this is more so of a vet lesson type of scenario for Brandon Moreno. He's going to, be competitive early with Kavanagh, but as we start to get into deeper water, look for Moreno to really start pulling away and teaching a lesson to the youngster. So give me Brandon Moreno, around 4 or 5 TKO, maybe even submission. I think he gets it done inside the distance in those main event rounds. So give me Moreno inside the distance. There you guys go. Full UFC Mexico City breakdown for you guys there. And as we obviously cap off every one of these podcasts, let's do a recap of this past weekend, which is not my shining moment, right? It was a pretty bad weekend. We'll start off with the one good side of the weekend, which was our Cage Warriors 200 card. Maybe not even good. Good enough compared to what happened on the rest of the weekend. We pretty much break even, slight green there for Cage Warriors 200. We cash on Alexander O'Sullivan, who was, I probably should have gone a full unit on, but he closed as like a plus 115 dog. So we got him at plus 205 the day before the fight. Very happy about that. We cash on the violence bet in the Adam Darby fight. We cash on the over 1.5 in the Leon Hill fight, which was our dog of the night play. We didn't have a lock of the night because there's just too much chalk, but we lose on Dario Belandi, who gets starched by Paddy McCrory. Pedro Silva, had to take an underdog shot against a guy that I did not think was all that good against Damian McKenna. And then Solomon Simon. I predicted him to win when he was minus 160. Then right before the card started, I saw him drop to minus 110. I'm like, I got to take advantage of this. And it did not play out well at all. Bagley's cardio held up for 25 minutes, much more than I expected it to. And Simon had no answer for the power grappling that was coming back his way. Thus, we end up losing that bet there. So plus 0.29 units there, 5% ROI. But that was the only green that we had for the rest of the weekend. Came up short on our single KSW play. I went with Daniel Skabinski, who I expected to showcase better cardio and a good enough smothering game in the second and third rounds. Unfortunately, the scar tissue and the big damage that his opponent landed outdid that work, and we end up losing 1.2 units there. And then the shit show of UFC Houston commenced. We'll start off with the good stuff. Our lock of the night play cashes with the Libby Idris. He comes in at minus 143. I think he ended up closing minus 130, but he did exactly what he needed to do. Really wasn't in any trouble in that matchup. Exactly the way that I expected that fight to go. He cashes for us. Our under 1.5 in the Jeff Neal fight ends up cashing as well, although it wasn't the person I expected to win. Jeff Neal ends up getting knocked out by Uro Šmedić, so we have to rip up our Jeff Neal ticket. Josiah Harrell. I did not expect him to get knocked out like that. That was some nasty ground and pound by Jacoby Smith. I expected if that fight were to hit the grappling realm, that Harrell would scramble enough to eventually work back to his feet. We saw him do it in the first takedown scenario, but in that second reversal from Jacoby Smith, Smith started landing big power before Harrell could even initiate a scramble, and he gets knocked out. Ante Delia, I did not expect him to get out-jabbed by Sergey Spivak. That slow start from Delia really cost him for the rest of the fight. He had a good second round where he nearly finished Spivak, but in that third round, it seemed like Spivak just did a little bit more, and that ultimately earned Spivak the decision win there. So that one was quite surprising. Chidi Njokuani, started the week plus 170, got dropped all the way down to about plus 100. We got in at plus 118, but you're not going to win a fight by being a punching bag in the first round the way he was against Carlos Leal. Leal just let go with big shots. I thought Njokuani did enough to win at least the second round, I think it was, but he just couldn't get off on enough strikes. Credit to Leal's cardio, credit to his ability to just continuously land big shots, and his chin, because he ate some big shots too, and he continued to move forward. So we end up taking an L on Chidi Njokuani. Continuing to move down this the tracking sheet here, we had a 0.11 shot on Juliana Miller by submission at plus 1800. She gave us good two opportunities. The beginning of the first round and the beginning of the third round. Credit to Judice for fighting off those close submission attempts. But, when you're shooting on a plus 1,800, you're hoping for those types of moments to justify the play. And I think it justified it. Unfortunately, we couldn't get over the finish line this time. Then our parlay, Yadir Del Valle. Holy crap, what kind of performance was that against Jordan Levitt? Right? I know there was a lot of hoopla after the fact that, the Isaac Dalgarian fight, Isaac is definitely guilty of fight fixing in that fight, considering how easily Levitt got Del Valle to the ground and grinded him out. And we know that's Dalgarian's, bread and butter. That's where he wins fights, by taking opponents to the ground, and he had no success against Del Valle. So very unfortunate there. Lebozniani grinds out a win, but unfortunately that parlay goes to shit. And then the Brahimaj Soriano under 2.5. I felt if Brahimaj looked to grapple a little bit earlier in round one, he probably could have come through with the finish for us, but he chose to strike and try to wear Soriano down. Unfortunately, it didn't work all that well for him. And then lastly, our dog of the night play with the Zachary Reese and Michel Pereira under 1.5 at plus 105 ends up crashing, as both guys' durability holds up way better than I expected it to. But I think there's also a little bit to be seen from the constant stop and starting in that first round, from those nut shots, the eye pokes, that really derails a lot of momentum in fights. And I think that had a little bit to do with why that under 1.5 didn't end up cashing either. But just so that ends a brutal UFC Houston for us, minus 7.98 units, minus 42% ROI. But when you knew that it was the one fight that kind of led me to believe that this card was just going to be weird altogether, was the fact that Dan Ige got finished for the first time in his career with a nasty spinning back kick from Melquizai Acosta. We've seen Ige eat big shots throughout his career and still managed to keep chugging forward. But the fact that he got finished, we knew it was going to be a weird card. And it even led to the main event where Fluffy got, the soft body issue come back to affect him again, as Sean Strickland, out of all people, not a guy you would expect to have impactful or threatening knees. Even he was able to land a big knee on Fluffy to drop him and end up finishing him there. Very weird card all in all. It's the name of the game. We had a tremendous UFC Vegas 113, but this is the game. There's highs and lows. This past weekend was definitely a low for the UFC card, and we're hoping to bounce back this weekend with UFC Mexico. And we also have an LFA card, LFA 227, going down on Friday. So stay tuned. I will drop an LFA breakdown for you guys on Thursday in the form of the Legacy Warriors podcast, but obviously a ton of other great UFC content coming out throughout the week. So make sure you guys hit that subscribe if you haven't already. I'll be going live on Tuesday from 8 p.m. Eastern to 9 p.m. Eastern. So make sure you guys tune in for that. Drop any comments, questions, and concerns. Now that you guys have been able to take in the MMA Lockcast, I'll be happy to answer all that for you guys. And then obviously back Saturday for the Fight Day live chat. I may or may not be doing a fight party or watch party for the fights. I might actually have some personal stuff coming up that night, but I'll let you guys know later on in the week if that's going to happen or not. All right. Appreciate the love. Appreciate the support. Hopefully we can bounce back this week. Let's see how it goes. I'll see you guys again tomorrow for the live stream on Tuesday. Peace.
Last thing.